Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo from DX Institute. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I think you must have taken some class on being energetic. You're like all moving around. It's like you're excited this time, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, I am excited. And it probably helps that I've been on the road the past couple of weeks. So, you get in that trade show mindset where you're just ready to meet everyone and go out and do things.
Nice and amped up. That's what
Yes,
we well, there's plenty to be amped up about this week. I mean, it has just been a crazy news week. So lots and lots to cover.
I know we're just in the middle of trade show season where all the vendors have been holding up their announcements just for this moment. And I the three that really have caught my attention from last week were ServiceNow Knowledge. We talk about ServiceNow frequently on this show because they are such an important IT platform. We also saw that both Red Hat Summit and Boomi World were in Denver last week. I just happened to be in Denver, so I was keeping track of those pretty closely as well. But each of these shows had some interesting details that are frankly relevant to CIO strategy. So I guess we can just kick off with ServiceNow, our the platform that we are always focused on looking at. And they had some interesting announcements. Of course, like every major mega vendor, ServiceNow is now putting out 30, 40, 50 press releases associated with their event, which is honestly is a bit too much. But when we dug through the weeds, we started finding some interesting announcements in there. And I'm curious what got your attention from a starting point, looking at ServiceNow Knowledge for this year.
So when I look at it, I mean, I'll preface the entire thing by saying that I was slightly underwhelmed by what they're doing. Now, in their defense, when you become this large of an organization, we've talked about this before, as organizations start to become bigger, it is really hard to continue to innovate at that kind of scale. So maybe we're holding them up to too high of a standard here, but in terms of the overall announcements, there was nothing that was like, oh wow, that was amazing or really knocked my socks off. So to me, the parts that are more interesting are the signaling, right? So one of the things, and in
Mhm.
fact, I don't know how many press releases in before I even caught this, but they are now at least in their press releases, at least in their like about ServiceNow sections, are referring to themselves as the AI platform for business transformation. And I think that's somewhat significant, again, from a signaling as to where they're going, because they started off, of course, as an IT service management player. Then their messaging was all about enterprise service management. And then they became much more focused on workflow automation. And then increasingly, and this part I think they are still hanging on to, now they've been talking about how work gets done and this idea. And so, like I said, I almost missed it that their opening line, ServiceNow, the AI platform for business transformation, was like, oh, that's really interesting that that's where they're trying to really anchor to AI. And so, what I struggle with a little bit on this is that there is just a slew of announcements. I mean, it's like almost staggering, but they were clearly trying to make Gen AI in particular a key part of it, and it just felt a little Me Too-ish. Somewhat ironically, for a company of this size and who has been making some pretty significant investments in AI from early on, but most of these were extensions. I mean, the big breakthrough announcements, I guess, were their model for their Now Assist product is now multimodal. I want to look at the use cases to get a better handle. So, what that means, it can take more than just text. So you can input images and video and some other, I guess, audio, video, and images. Um, I'm not clear what the use cases are, if that's really as big of a deal. They also have this old BYO model kind of approach where
Mhm.
you can now use their LLM, you can use a custom LLM, or theoretically a standard LM. I don't know why you would do that. I mean, to me, I read through that one three times and it was scratching my head a little bit. It was like, well, on the surface, you go, of course, you want the flexibility, and I'm sure this is being driven by pressure from large enterprises that are saying, I need all this flexibility. But if I look at the use cases that should be driving where ServiceNow is applied, I don't know that that's where I'd be applying a custom LLM, right? We've talked a lot about Databricks and their approach of every
Yeah.
enterprise building
Mhm.
they're an LLM, but I look at those use cases, and so those are going to be customer facing. Those are going to be, or maybe my ERP facing, but not the kind of stuff that I would typically apply to ServiceNow. So that one left me. Sounded good until I sort of thought about it for a minute and was like, okay. They also introduced something called Creator Studio, which is finally a true no code sort of um, view for sort of citizen development. Left a lot of unanswered questions for me as to, so do I still need low code? Presumably, because they introduced a whole bunch of Gen AI for the developer side of the platform. Clearly, that's still a huge part of what they're doing. So to me, a lot of ambiguity as to now, what do I use for what? So, to me, it was a lot of, and then a lot of the actual Gen AI stuff was sort of, stuff that others have had and they were kind of catching up on. So I was left sort of feeling underwhelmed. The most interesting thing for me, and then I want to hear your take on it, is really ironic, I guess, because it was a partnership with Genesys, is a company
Mhm.
that I've been a fan of and followed for a long time. They sort of do customer facing experience management. And so their partnership, if they now are having, they will by the end of this year, I guess, have a unified or a joint go to market that is called Unified Experience. And it's basically a turnkey application that includes both Genesys and ServiceNow's customer service management. I think it's the CSM
Mhm.
product. And the idea is it blends or hooks front office and back office together. So when you're managing that experience and there's some kind of a fall and break in that service and you need to now execute some form of internal process to fix it, now these are joined at the hip and then supposedly with this AI layer, whatever. But that I think is really interesting. And I think it's mostly interesting because I think this is the wall that ServiceNow has been unable to break, or it's been unclear if they even wanted to break it because it would put them into competition with so many people.
Mhm.
And so I think this may be the playbook for the future as they are carving out room of competing and trying to bolt these things together where they become the baked in back end to these customer facing front ends. And I think that could be a really smart play for them. So of all this sort of stuff, that was the one that I almost missed and I think was actually the most interesting of everything I saw. So that was my take.
Yeah, moving backwards from that, I feel like there's this trend for these, call it large tech companies who are not quite the mega market leaders, like the ServiceNows, the Workdays of the world, and saying kind of to be blunt, like F it, we're just gonna go for it. Like we used to have all these partners that we worked with for these niche use cases, but now we're gonna just work with the big kids. So ServiceNow is saying we're going to work with Fujitsu, we're going to work with Genesys, we're going to work with Infosys on these big solutions for customer service and manufacturing. And yeah, we used to have this ecosystem that did this, but now we're going to start bringing a lot of that in-house because honestly, we have to take them on to get that next billion or 2 billion in revenue. These companies are making big goals, big projections to say we're going to go from 5 billion, 6 billion to 10 billion to 15 billion. And you can't do that without stepping on a few toes. So now we're going to see an interesting balancing process of how do we go after those extra few billion, that next few $1 billion in revenue. And there's definitely a lot of increasing stratification of seeing more and more of that focus going towards the biggest companies and the biggest markets. So also not a mistake that they're talking about Fujitsu, as everybody wants that Japanese tech market. Moving a little bit backwards on the product side, I agree that everything sounds a little bit Me Too-ish at this point. But I do think that both ServiceNow's breadth of talking about trying to be a control plane across RPA, API integration, documents, process mining, governance, and kind of saying we want to be the centralized view for all of the agents and capabilities that you're doing across all these areas is a point of interest. It's not the only company doing that, as we're going to talk about a little bit later. But I think doing that is interesting. And I think that no code environment for that creator studio is an interesting idea in that, from my understanding, the idea here is that you can develop prompts that lead to actual applications or at least services or automated workflows that can be created going forward. So this actually creates a natural language starting point for creating apps. Whether it ends up working like that or not, and whether these apps are robust enough to actually fit into a software development lifecycle, there were, as you said, there are a lot of details that were kind of left out here. If ServiceNow can deliver on that plan, that's an interesting next step in this low code application development world that we've been looking at for the past decade or so, and an actual use case for generative AI, which may lead to some value, but we'll see. But one of the quotes I found interesting in the ServiceNow press release was an IDC quote, basically saying that they expected Gen AI to grow to 40 billion in revenue in a couple years, and then up to 150 billion a couple years after that. And as someone who deals with a lot of ROI and business value stuff, like I look within those numbers, and basically that translates to me in IDC's thinking that there's going to be about 300 billion to 400 billion in business value that is created. Like if you work backwards from the ROI, that's basically what it translates into. So now all these companies are of course, they're happy about those IDC numbers, but now they have to make those cases for how that $300 billion in business value is going to be created. I'm not wedded to that number. I don't know how much I believe that number, but I do think that is kind of a commitment in a number that a lot of vendors are now going to be trying to fit themselves into.
Well, we're gonna talk about this later, I think, but this leads to like I have a great respect for IDC, and I think overall, I generally trust their data, but this one I find very suspect. I find it very suspect on both fronts. One to your point, the ROI of the business value. I think right now that is still very much an unknown quantity. I'm not saying it's not possible. I'm just saying I don't think there's any clear pathways for most organizations to anywhere near those numbers. And I think as a result, we're not seeing the spending. We're seeing a lot of experimentation, but we aren't seeing that heavy spending. The other thing there was so much in the ServiceNow announcements. There's another quote that their Now Assist, which is their Gen AI product, supposedly their best-selling product in history. Now, I don't know enough about their pricing. That was staggering to me, if that's true, but I don't know. Again, they didn't expose any of the mechanics of exactly what that meant. So, but if it's a significant price point and that's a significant amount of revenue, then that would in fact be a more stronger indication of this. I find it a little suspect. So we'll see where all that kind of lands around it. But I look at, they had there was another one that was a kind of weird thing. They had this big focus. They kept bringing it up about their strategic portfolio management. So this is one of their Now Assist bots, and I just found it so interesting that this, what I feel was a fairly narrow banded kind of application, got so much space. So, I feel like there's just so much grasping at this, and I feel like there's, again, the article that we're going to talk about later, so much grasping for just being relevant, of being included in all the hype and all the conversations around it. And I guess, maybe I'm holding ServiceNow to too high of a standard, but that disappoints me a little bit, because one of the things that I've always appreciated about ServiceNow is they were very focused on delivering on the pragmatic execution, and this just felt a little hypey. So,
Yeah. I always find portfolio management solutions interesting, because I feel like they're very attractive to tech product managers, because they are about managing products. And of course, tech product managers love tools that help them to manage products. But honestly, not everybody in IT thinks of every service and every asset and every capability as a product. Maybe they should. Maybe that's the best way to think of IT as a business. But the reality is, as we know from talking to CIOs across the board, this is not a common mindset. There are definitely companies that do think about every IT service as a product because of that IT as a business mindset, but it is not the prevalent majority CIO or IT mindset out there. So I think this is to some extent ServiceNow wanting portfolio and product management to be more important to the IT office than it actually is.
It could be. Well, and that brings up one last point before I know we need to move on to talk about, we'll go to Boomi next here, but the one other thing to talk about, I think, was that if I were to boil everything that they announced across the spectrum here and boil it up, the one big message that got through loud and clear is that they are focusing on the very largest companies, their
Hmm.
partnerships, their products, their all of this was telegraphing that they're focusing on the very, very large companies. And I think if you're a smaller organization using ServiceNow, that at least potentially should give you pause because that is really where they are clearly and as no surprise, I guess, with the numbers that they're putting out and the numbers they're telegraphing here, they have to. I mean, they have to get to this massive scale, and that's going to make it harder for them to continue to focus on the smaller organizations, at least in their needs. So anyway,
Right. It's
that's
a
that.
little reminiscent of Salesforce, how they went enterprise and then HubSpot came up to take up that mid-market from them.
Yeah, yeah,
And
and I think that
yeah.
it definitely is going to be leaving some room here. So, and that's going to be its own little
So you said
fight, I
last week
think. But
ITSM was dead, but despite that, there might still be an opportunity for a mid-market ITSM now.
a mid-market service now. I don't know that an ITSM play is going to do it, but the idea of following that playbook, but focusing on the mid-market, I think there may be something there.
Mhm.
Speaking of which, sort of big companies and the big challenges. Let's talk a little bit about Boomi, and I will go on record to start with, and I want to hear your take on this. But I I have tuned Boomi out until maybe the last year or two.
Mhm.
It's like they when they were acquired by Dell, and we've talked about this when these big companies acquire these, that's sort of where they go to die, and that's sort of what Dell Boomi was, right? It was just like, yeah, they're there, but
Mhm.
whatever, nobody's paying any attention any longer. And then the last couple of years, I went to an event 2 years ago. I think honestly it was at a rooftop here in New York City, and I just wanted to go to that rooftop. It's the only reason I showed up.
Sure.
But I was talking to some of the Boomi folks, and it was like, oh, they're going some of the right directions. I like that, and so I've been following them a little bit more closely for the last couple of years, and I think it's culminating in this announcement. So I'll let you kind of walk us all through it, but I will just set the stage that I've been sort of a detractor historically, or at least the last, I don't know, 8 or 10 years. And I was actually really intrigued and pleased by what I heard out of them coming out of this announcement. So you were there. What was your take?
Yeah, so I've covered Boomi pretty deeply over the past decade or so. They've been a market leader in iPaaS integration platform as a service for a long time, competing against everybody from Workato to Informatica to SnapLogic, all the usual suspects in that application integration world. And they've been doing an okay job of it, but they've struggled to figure out where to go next. A couple years ago, a lot of that changed when they brought Steve Lucas on board. So Steve Lucas, former high-ranked SAP executive, then CEO at Marketo, obviously has been successful at each stop that he's been, growing his business. And now he's here at Boomi. So they came out with both an interesting vision and a couple of announcements that ended up being fairly meaningful. First of all, Boomi wants to be the business connectivity platform and realizes that application integration is not enough. And in that light, they announced a couple of acquisitions in the API management space. The first being a company called Apida, which is a control plane for managing various API gateways. And then the second one being the Mashery assets. So for those of you with a long memory, Mashery used to be the hottest company in terms of talking about APIs. A decade ago, everybody wanted to be like Mashery in terms of how you managed APIs. And then they got acquired by Intel and they kind of disappeared. And then they kind of got acquired. And then they got acquired by Tibco. And then, Tibco has been going through its own private equity issues. And honestly, Mashery is kind of a shadow of what it used to be. But there's still this long background of managing APIs. So this gives Boomi a head start in moving forward in managing APIs. So Boomi realizes, okay, we're going to have application integration. We've already been doing web data. Now we have this API piece. And then they also are interested in the future of data management and AI agent management. They see themselves as a control plane to be able to connect all of these areas where you have a lot of choices, and then Boomi can be your one source of connectivity. So it's an ambitious plan, but a little bit like ServiceNow, Boomi is starting to say, well, we have all these partners, we had all these partners across API management, data management, AI management, and now we're going to have to kind of go against them for us to be able to grow and to be able to manage, take full advantage of our own application integration capabilities and our current business.
Yeah, so I will say I draw this as a sharp contrast to the sort of ServiceNow. I think the same challenge, but I think that the circumstances are different. I think that when we're talking about this data integration layer, it is really hard to have it disjointed. So I'm apparently big on taglines this week. So they're in their tagline, they're talking a lot about integration automation, or how they're describing themselves in these announcements. And I think that's super, super important and super, super smart. That it isn't just about the abstraction that an integration has historically been. They're also making a case in here that this is really, in this AI economy, as they're referring to it, which I think is a fair description, that there's all this fragmentation, and that the enabler is in fact your ability to have a cohesive data layer and data pipeline that allows you to actually apply. You can't apply AI on top of crappy data. And this is a very significant issue. And I think they are smartly recognizing that it's not just about the traditional way we've approached data integration. And so, I look at this, and I mean, in this announcement, they talked about sort of three different pieces: API management, AI agents, and like a data management layer. And I think it is so smart and so critical, because it is actually addressing the real challenges that organizations are facing. Is that I have to be dealing with all these APIs, and right now they've normally been shuttled off to this obscure API team someplace that has done, it's been whack-a-mole kind of an approach. I'm not sure that it's quite as unique as maybe they're carving out. There are definitely some players like Postman and SmartBear and others that are doing a lot of innovative things in API management, but it is a critical piece. And the big distinction is that those guys that's all they're doing, right? So here you're combining it with a core data integration platform, and then they add some of the data management capabilities around, MDM and some of these other pieces of it, which I think is super, super critical, that I can now have like a governance layer that I can start baking into this. And this idea of AI agents, that you can start actually applying some intelligence in a very smart way. And here's the other thing I love, and we're going to talk about this with Red Hat in a second. One of the growing trends we're starting to see is that people are finally getting off the "it's all Gen AI" hype thing, and they're talking here about this AI agents are combining elements of both Gen AI and predictive AI components together to provide some autonomous actions, and yes, provide a conversational layer maybe, but just really, really interesting stuff that's actually solving the real problems, and not just, oh, look, we've got a conversational agent that can do something. And so I think it's a super smart approach, very cohesive, hangs together, solves real problems. So I loved it. I mean, it's always gonna come down to the execution, but the fact that they got this, I think, so right, sets them up well going forward.
Yes, and I got to talk to some of the executives at Boomi World, and it's interesting. I found that across the board, they were all very invested in the idea of agentic AI. Not a surprise, since they are talking so much about managing agents and saying, yes, you might have 30, 40, 50 agents at the end of the day, and you need to know which ones to talk to and which ones to use for specific use cases. We want to be the connectivity layer between them. That makes a whole lot of sense. But they also said, but we can't bring ourselves to use the phrase agentic AI yet in our marketing, because it's just such a buzzword, which I can't disagree with. Like, we're going to use it. We're going to continue to use it because it describes our view of AI, and it's a good view of AI. But it was interesting for me to hear that, oh, although they are bought into the concept, we're not bought into the term.
So they're willing to call them AI agents, but they're just not agentic AI. Okay, well, fine, sure. One of the things, by the way, before we skip that, one of the other things that I think is really important. So they announced 4 agents. I just lost him here. Boomi Answers, which is sort of their conversational piece. The Data Detective, which is doing data classification, some other things. Design Gen, which is building integrations, and Scribe, which is documentation. Again, love that it's so pragmatic, really dealing with their specific, how to apply it to their specific thing. But really notable is that it's also an extensible layer that their partners are building, can now build on top of this, and others can build on top. So I think that it's this really interesting approach that is, again, very pragmatic on actually solving real issues. So I find it hilarious that they are for some reason hesitating with the term. I actually don't think it's that fuzzy. I feel like most people still haven't even heard it when I talk about it, but I think sometimes you live in the bubble, so to speak, and you think that
Mhm.
you sometimes lose that perspective. But well, good stuff. I'm really excited, and so there's good energy in the room. Their customers seem to be reacting positively.
Yeah, it was a relatively large show for them. I believe about 9,000 people showing up, and they made a big deal of it. Of course, Denver was a nice location, a great change from the normal Vegas or Orlando trade show cycle that you normally see. And honestly, I think customers were excited to hear that there was more to happen here because so many iPaaS solutions get stuck on saying we are just going to be connectors, your 200 or 300 connectors for your major applications. And then we're really not going to do much there except to build some recipes or workflows or a little bit of magic on the front end to make you feel a little better. But
Well, my whole business really is I help organizations help with their messaging and talk more strategically to that CIO buyer and what have you. And I think they nailed it. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that now suddenly is extremely relevant. I mean, one of the challenges for data integration is the CIO pays attention only if they absolutely have to, right? It's not a value. It doesn't feel like a value generating thing, and yet we all know it's absolutely critical to the flow and to be able to execute. And so it's like a thorn in the side, and this sort of elevates it where it's starting to talk about it much more strategically. And so like I said, definitely I feel like that Roger Ebert, and he's just going to thumbs up for this one.
thumbs
I
up.
thought this was a good.
Yes. All
So
right.
the other show is Red Hat, which I want you to lead with definitely, because it is definitely starting to get outside of my space, but I do have a couple comments on some of their announcements.
Yeah, obviously Red Hat, an open source market leader, as well as one that is core to managing infrastructure in the IT world. I think they made several announcements that were interesting at Red Hat Summit and were comprehensible to me as a non-IT infrastructure manager. One was simply about being on Oracle Cloud. I think every company is starting to realize that we've got to be on Oracle Cloud. They are a legitimate alternative and increasingly growing in scale. They have learned probably from the missteps that IBM made in trying to be a major cloud provider and are more careful with the steps they're taking. And now Red Hat is saying, yes, we have to be on Oracle Cloud as well. Second announcement I thought was really interesting was about Red Hat introducing the concept of policy as code on Red Hat Ansible. The idea that you can get more technical policies and develop them as code and then update them as code in a more scalable way. That way you can enforce policies across all of your data and application environments more easily rather than having to do this in a manual configuration process, which has been the de rigueur like standard for decades, right? When we think about GRC, governance, risk management, and compliance, and the need to manage policies, it is an extremely painful and manual process, very legalistic in accounting, in nature. You're popping off all of those little boxes and switching all those little toggles on an application or platform specific basis a lot of the time to try to make sure that you have the policies managed correctly. So simply moving to a code-based model there, I see is very valuable and kind of in line with what we were talking about with previous announcements in managing policy and workflows in a more programmatic and scalable fashion. So I find that it really interesting. And then probably the other announcement that really caught my eye was around Red Hat and Elastic working together for managing retrieval augmented generation. We've talked about retrieval augmented generation a fair bit in previous shows as an important way of being able to manage generative AI. And having Red Hat and Elastic working together to provide both of the data infrastructure as well as the hardware infrastructure to support AI customization is an important piece of the puzzle because right now we are seeing extreme fragmentation. There are so many potential vendors you can work with to try to make AI work. And simply having Red Hat throw their hat into the ring and say, we are going to make your life a little bit easier if you actually want to do all this stuff in a cost effective manner without having to figure out 38 different pieces of the puzzle to put together. I think that is useful productivity, a piece of productivity from for IT trying to actually put all this into production.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, well, so first I want to comment on something you said the at the very beginning, talking about the Oracle piece. What I think is remarkable, sort of separate from these announcements, is
Mhm.
that we've talked a lot about these large companies acquiring other companies that tend to sort of go there and if not die, stagnate. And I mean, I believe this is true of many of the IBM acquisitions. I think it is absolutely remarkable how untrue that has been in Red Hat's case. That Red
Mhm.
Hat seems to be the tail wagging the dog to positive effect. Red Hat has remained incredibly relevant, still continuing to lead the charge across a lot of different dimensions, and that's remarkable and
Yeah, I just
positive.
think
So
about Broadcom VMware right now as a counter example of how quickly it can get messed up if you don't have your eye on the ball.
yeah, well, and so this Oracle announcement is a key part of that. Right? I mean, clearly IBM has its own cloud that it at least likes to think is competitive in the market and is competing with Oracle, and yet here Red Hat says we have to be playing nicely and being a part of it. So I think
Mhm.
that's a testament. And if I'm a CIO, I take that as a signal and a really positive signal that this is an organization I can continue to invest in because they're sending all the right things. They're recognizing that they're not just part of this IBM monolith and they're recognizing my reality, which I think is my big takeaway when I look at this is that I've been harping on in the DX report sort of countering all the hype about dealing with the pragmaticism of all of this, dealing with keeping it real on how to do this. We've talked a little bit about some of this today with some of the challenges with just addressing what's actually happening. And one of the things that I love about Red Hat's messaging here is they're talking a little bit about this idea of at least a term I don't think I've heard called what they're calling hybrid AI, right?
Mhm.
This idea that, hey, you're running hybrid IT environments, you're running hybrid cloud. Guess what? Your AI environment's also going to be hybrid. And I think it makes complete sense. It's obvious to anyone who thinks about it for 2 seconds. And yet almost all the stuff we're talking about in the AI hype stream is acting like it's this whole separate thing. And so they made some announcements that I thought were very, very important around sort of that pragmatic hybrid approach. So
Mhm.
one is some new enhancements that will allow you to serve models at the edge, which I think is going to be super super critical. They're talking about in remote where there's either intermittent access or air gap network environments, super critical for actually applying this stuff and making sense of it. This idea of model serving, where you're have an environment that isn't just serving up Gen AI type models, but actually can do predictive as well. Again, very, very pragmatic that we need a way to manage these environments cohesively, not treating them as they're these sort of separate areas. And a bunch of these other sort of similar things. They get very deep in the weeds. Frankly, most of what Red Hat does is too technical for me. I do question to a certain extent. My only sort of big thing is so much of what they do is focused on the very largest organizations at many enterprises. This is sort of beyond them, but I do think that it's important because it's going to have, at the very least, the sort of trickle down effect as we see, or the organizations take this out of abstraction layers, make it simpler for smaller organizations to deploy, because this is where it's all going. It's about how do you start making this stuff pragmatic and so you can apply it. Because if you can't apply it and actually do something with it, then all those crazy business valuations we were talking about earlier are just never going to come to fruition. And so that's what I really loved about what they're doing, and that this was, again, I'm so sensitive. Probably why I was so hard on ServiceNow. I'm so sensitive right now to just this, kind of hand waving hype, and I want to see people that are doing things that are actually applying it in meaningful ways. And I thought that Red Hat did that here.
Yeah, and I think just to dig one layer deeper, I think that Red Hat using Kubernetes to support AI on Kubernetes is important because that portability is going to be important. You're going to want to move models between the cloud and your servers, and perhaps even to the edge over time, depending on how quickly computing continues to scale and grow. I think Codeflare is very important in terms of managing task orchestration, supporting the monitoring of these workflows. So again, we are talking about the very basic blocking and tackling of treating AI as a production application and uh, having infrastructure to support that, no matter where that be, whether it be on the edge or in your core or in the cloud. All of that shouldn't matter at the end of the day, because you should be able to make business decisions about where your model should be, whether you're governed or whether you're trying to support very specific remote environments. None of that should really matter at the end of the day if you have the model that you're looking for. And that is where Red Hat is preparing for the future. And honestly, these might not be investments that pay off this year, but I feel like they will be extremely important next year once CIOs realize the mess that they are in. And unfortunately, a lot of CIOs are going to find themselves in this situation, not through any fault of their own, really, but because they've been asked to experiment and they've been pushed by the business to do specific things with AI.
Well, and it just that there's so much unknown. I mean, everything is still changing so fast that, we talk about technical debt, and technical debt is often being viewed as this, oh, I made short-sighted decisions. But a lot of technical debt comes from this sort of environment where it's not that they're short-sighted, we just have no line of sight to what's actually going to happen. And
Mhm.
so you place some bets, you make some gambles, or you do some experimentation. And in doing so, because that's how enterprises work, they get entrenched if they work. And I now have some technical debt that I'm going to have to deal with. And so I do think there's going to be a whole lot of operationalizing this that's going to get very challenging. And it's going to get very nuanced. So I think, organizations like Red Hat that I think are sort of getting down into those weeds and starting to provide these layers and these tools to make it more manageable, I think is critical. And I think it's also, so you talk about long term. I think that we're going to see this coming of age. Is that the right story? I don't know. No, this comeuppance. That's the
Mhm.
word. So there's an article in CNBC talked about, it was a bunch of anonymous sources. This was about 10 days ago now, that AI engineers are reporting they're burned out because they're being rushed to execute these rollouts because there's this rat race, as the article called it, to stay competitive. And the big point of this article was that it's all about hype. It's all
Mhm.
about the fact that it's about how do you make some news versus how do you actually deliver some value. And they didn't name any specific companies, at least I don't think. But I feel like we saw some of that play out here, right? I think, you
Mhm.
know, some of my criticism around ServiceNow is I felt like that's a lot of what we sort of got. I feel like Boomi and Red Hat have done a good job, but frankly, the reason they are refreshing to me is they are the exception, not the rule. I feel like more often than not, what we're seeing out of organizations is a bunch of hand waving, a bunch of, oh, look, we're doing something. You made a comment in our email exchange prepping for this about, can you be competitive if you're just, using an API and attaching to OpenAI's
Mhm.
LLM and creating some Gen AI. I think that there's so much of this going on that it's really, really challenging to sort of separate from the wheat from the chaff and figure out exactly what it should be. But for me, I think the big message to a CIO is, buyer beware. Don't be. It's really easy to get sucked into all the hype, but it is. I think there's so much smoke and mirrors going on, and not to say the technology is not real, but it's just like, is it? You need to really ask yourself, is this going to help me solve a business problem? And if so, what is that?
Yes, I
So I
really
don't know.
worry that vendors are just spending too much time trying to match functional parity with each other, when that is not really the long game right now. Every software vendor looking at generative AI really needs to think about how generative AI actually fits into their solution. And as common sense as that sounds, that's not how a lot of this AI development is happening right now. Everybody is saying, well, if they have some sort of Gen AI supported help desk, then we need to have some sort of Gen AI supported help desk. Even if our actual product documentation is so simple that it can still be supported with a basic rules-based help desk. Like all of this common sense stuff that you would think would matter in terms of development is going out the window, as everybody's saying, well, if we don't have Gen AI to support every single part of our application, then we're falling behind. And honestly, that is not the case. There are still plenty of applications where the users are fairly niche in number and in skill sets, and they are used to a specific interface that they've used for 20 years. And sometimes that UX is just fine for your basic administrative viewpoint. You don't have to suddenly change this to Gen AI, where honestly, that means a new set of adoption needs to take place and a new set of training needs to take place. And a lot of hours will honestly be killed for these administrators and power users to figure out how to do the exact same things that they've been doing for 5, 10, 15, 20 years.
And is that value add, and is it in fact faster, and all those things that we talked a lot about the ROI, some of the like Microsoft's productivity, based copilots. Is there actually an ROI? Can you actually drive that? One article that we didn't have time to talk about today that we'll maybe talk about next week talked about the fact that we're still incredibly early days in terms of usage
Yes.
around it, right? So it's like we haven't even really gone to that point where we're even seeing how these things are applied yet. And let's not forget, not everyone sees all this as a positive. And this is, I think, the one we can end the show on, this little piece of the conversation. Apple introduced a new iPad this week, and it was like this big fanfare. And I'm actually excited about some of what they did. And they have this new M4 chip that's the AI chip. But they released an ad, a video that was supposed to be a TV ad that showed this big machine crushing all of these instruments of creativity, so musical instruments and paints and all this stuff, and it comes out and it's an iPad, and the idea was that what they're trying to convey is, hey, look, all of this creativity is in this little thing, but what Bill took it as was, you're destroying all of this
Yes.
creativity, right? And it was a super negative thing, and I think that it speaks to the fact that there's still a whole lot of fear going on around all of this, and what does this mean to jobs, and there is a vitriol reaction to it. So I think that if you're a tech company, paying attention to that and maybe not trying to just chase the hype is not necessarily a bad thing if you stay focused on the value and you acknowledge the fear and the challenges around all of this and try to actually carve a pathway forward. And I think you can do that and create competitive differentiation and not get sucked into, just wrapped up in all the hype around it.
Yeah, I definitely had a visceral reaction to that. I love my cello Eliza right here. We've been around for 3 decades together. Just watching the instruments and the paint and all these things, all of the history of human artistic endeavor being crushed by a hydraulic press was not the artistic statement that I was looking for. It is exactly the fear of every actor who went on strike last year, worried that generative AI was going to take their job, all the writers that went on strike, all the artists who are currently wondering what their futures are. Trying to crush all of those dreams and all of those tools and showing that in an advertisement was definitely not the best message for AI as a harbinger for the future of mankind.
Exactly. Well, I think they learned their lesson, but it's a lesson that I think a lot of the tech companies in our space could probably learn from as well. So hopefully they pay attention.
Yes, hopefully the human side of AI will continue to come out rather than the Terminator T800, T1000 version of humanity, Skynet, coming out.
Exactly.
Yeah, and with that, we're going to call it a week. It was obviously a busy time for enterprise AI and enterprise IT, and it's going to continue to be busy, honestly, with shows from Snowflake, Databricks, IBM, all sorts of big vendors coming up, Microsoft, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to keep you up to date on what really matters and what you need to think about for the CIO office. And with that, thanks for joining us. If you're watching us on YouTube, like, subscribe, comment, and just let us know what else you want us to cover for next week. Thanks a lot and have a great week.